Everybody. Welcome to the Collective Impact Forum's June virtual coffee. I am Jennifer Slansky-Jester, Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are so delighted to have you here with us today. Before we dive into our conversation with today's guest, I'm just going to spend a few minutes orienting us to the session and doing a few logistics and housekeeping remarks. So today's conversation will run for about 60 minutes. We'll spend roughly the first half with some questions that you all have shared ahead of time with me in conversation with our guests, and then we will open it up to live questions from you all. On your screen in your webinar platform, there is a question box that you'll see in the lower right-hand corner. That's the best place to put your questions, and we'll be monitoring that as they come in. So our final note I will say is we're making a recording of this chat, and it will be available to all of you afterwards. And so you can stay tuned for the recording that we'll send out after the webinar. Okay. Sorry, I think there might be a little bit of feedback. I'll work on that on the phone line. But in the interim, I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Robert Albright, to take us through a quick poll.
Great. Thanks, Jen. It's good to talk to everybody. I'm going to launch a poll right now, and everyone will see it pop up on your screen in just a moment. So the question that I'm going to hit launch on right now is, how often do you use data in your collective impact work? And this is, you can choose one option here, and I see some of the results starting to come in, which is great. So the options are daily, 1 to 2 times per week, monthly, quarterly, or not applicable, or never. So we've got about half of you have already voted, and I will share the results in maybe 10 seconds. Let me give it a few more seconds, maybe 5 more seconds. About 2/3 of you have already voted, which is great. Take a couple more seconds. Perfect. Okay, so 15% of you use data daily in your collective impact work, 19% 1 to 2 times per week, 31% monthly, 18% quarterly, and 15% not applicable or never. So thank you for sharing those survey thoughts, and I'll close the poll and turn it back over to Jen. Jen, can you hear me?
And thank you, Robert. Great, here we are. So with that, I am so delighted to introduce our 2 guests for today from Living Cities. So first we have with us JaNay Queen Nazaire, who is an amazing leader, collaborator, and bridge builder with a fierce belief in the right of all people to live their best possible life. As an associate director at Living Cities, she coaches city leaders to collaborate across sectors for powerful social justice results for people on the ground. She contributes to the strategic vision of Living Cities and empowers staff to work to improve the lives of low-income people. She has a rich past experience working on outcomes for children and families in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, as well as in academia, teaching leadership and public policy. Her work has contributed to her passion for harnessing cross-sector collaboration to guide leaders of U.S. cities as they advocate for those people who have been disproportionately left out and systemically denied of economic opportunity. JaNay is focused on results in all the work she does, views equity challenges in cities as exciting opportunities to re-examine the impact we can create for the country's most marginalized communities. Then we also are delighted to have Jeff Raderstrong join us. Jeff joined Living Cities in May 2014 as a program associate on the Integration Initiative. He's now a senior associate and supports multiple aspects of Living Cities' efforts to determine best practices for creating large-scale system change in places around the country. He's worked on several projects to codify and disseminate key lessons learned, from community engagement to the data work that we'll be talking about today. And before coming to Living Cities, Jeff worked as an associate at Venture Philanthropy Partners, where he led the assessment of its nonprofit portfolio, amongst many other very important roles. So with that, I'm really excited that we can dive into our conversation with Jeff and JaNay. Before we do that, just one more thing I'll point out on the screen. We have our Twitter hashtags on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Hashtag Collective Impact, hashtag CI Virtual Coffee, and we'd encourage you to take this conversation over to Twitter, social media, if you are so inclined. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff and JaNay just to give us a little bit of background and orientation on the ways that they have been supporting communities and the data work, in the data work that communities are doing, and to orient us to some of the resources that they've compiled that are going to help inform their perspectives in today's conversation.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Yep. So I can get started to talk a little bit about the communities, and then Jeff, if you want to talk about some of the resources that we put out with the data series blog. So first of all, welcome everyone. I can't see you all, hope you see us. Excited to be here, and thank you Collective Impact Forum team for having us. Part of the work that we do that sort of in our Collective Impact portfolio is in a set of cities. Right now we're working in 5 cities deeply: Albuquerque, Baltimore, New Orleans, the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, and San Francisco. And the leaders in these cities are trying to solve big intractable problems. And so what we have been working with them on is how do we actually go about changing systems to get results for people. And so in that conversation, as Living Cities started the integration initiative, which is just one of the things that we do, we said, well, we have a frame, borrowing somewhat from Strive and some other areas that we invested in, but let's use a results frame. Let's use data to drive these decisions, because we know that since forever, people have been working towards change. We were standing on the shoulders of giants, and so to honor and acknowledge the work that has been done before us, we wanted to build on that. And so in each of the cities, for example, that we worked in, we said, what's your common agenda? What's your shared result? What's that big, bold goal? Whatever the language is that you want to use, what is the end in mind? And so we worked really deeply with cities to kind of get a frame for their work. What do you want to achieve? And then let's back map into that by identifying some key indicators. In some places they're indicators, in some places they're called outcomes. Again, there's different labels, but the idea behind those labels are that we want to track progress. We want to measure progress towards our big results. So how are we going to do that? And so each of our cities actually worked with a cross-sector set of leaders to identify a common agenda, and in this common agenda was the big result. So in Albuquerque, they wanted women and immigrants to be employed, for example. In New Orleans, it was about African-American men earning family-sustaining wages and so forth. And so there's these big goals. And then they set up indicators to track along a continuum from 3 to 10 years to determine whether or not they were on the right path. And these indicators were developed, for example, from the community, from the table of leaders, from what was necessary to understand whether or not change was happening. And so that's sort of how we started the data process in our cities. And I'll dig a little deeper into some of those as the conversation continues, but that's just one level and one place where we started. And so, Jeff, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about our tools.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, JaNay, and thanks to Jen and Robert and everyone else at our Collective Impact Forum for having us. So as JaNay just outlined, we did a lot of different types of work focused around results and data in cities. And at Living Cities, one thing that we've committed to is not only helping our partners and our grantees, but also helping the broader field to sort of learn from us as we learn from them, and share our lessons learned to help people like you all on this call get your results faster, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel and sort of make the same mistakes that others have made. And so in the work that we did that JaNay just outlined, we decided that we could add a lot of value by diving really deep on this topic of data and collective impact broadly, and more specifically, we can talk about those more specific areas in the rest of the conversation, and sort of, share tools that we've created, that others have created, synthesis around lessons learned, a broad framework for how to think about data, and put out, a series of tools and blog posts over several months that we did about a year ago now. All of these are on the website. It's at the link on your screen. I really encourage you to check them out. It's sort of framed as a 5-part blog series, and while we did it in a sort of a linear way, it's really more about meeting people where they are, depending on what challenge they have around data. So there's resources if you're at sort of the beginning stages and you're trying to agree on that shared result or shared goals that JaNay was talking about. There's resources if you're at the further along and want to really move to action and performance management and continuous improvement. And of course, as you all are probably aware, this is an iterative process, and once you get to one stage, you have to go back to another, or you realize that actually we should have done this first, and it's kind of it's a messy iterative process. And so we wanted to provide people a full spectrum of tools across the board for where you're at. So again, there's a lot in this research that we did. We talked to a lot of different practitioners, some of which are probably on this call. So, really looking forward to the questions and to diving in deeper and sharing more.
Great. Thank you, Jeff and JaNay. So we have a number of questions that people on the line submitted in advance, and I will dive into those, and we'll see where they take us. So the first question I wanted to start with is really related to the process of using the data. So how do you get disparate organizations to agree to share data despite confidentiality concerns? And do you have any concrete examples of success in this area that you'd be able to share with the group?
I will start. This question I love this question because it's the answer is technical and adaptive, right? So there's a process for which you use or follow to gather people to do this work, right? But the adaptive work is around building relationships, having resources, making sure that there's trust, and having enough people be willing to take risks. There's a mental model that I have, and it's sort of the combination of the relationships, the resources, and the risk times the discipline is what it takes to get to results. And so in my history of doing this work, one thing that I have found is that if people can see themselves in the result, or at least along the way to the result, then that allows you to generate buy-in. And so there's a trade-off, right? So it's like, okay, I get that this is like you're working on a whole different body of work, but it's in service of the same goal or a shared goal. If we prioritize our work, if we pool our resources together, P-O-O-L and P-U-L-L, right? Pool our resources, we can maximize our impact, right? And so the win for you is, and the win for me is, and so people actually have to be willing to give up something. There's some loss that's associated with choosing to come together and align around shared data, and then the leveraging of leaders and who can give cover to the issues around confidentiality. So who are the partners with a role to play that can provide the cover, that can provide the safety net for the risks associated with confidentiality. I have one example, and then Jeff, I'll jump in. In Eastside Promise Neighborhood, the Eastside Promise Neighborhood Collaborative, they were able to bring together partners who were really, really nervous about sharing information. They wanted to protect families, they wanted to protect teachers, they wanted to protect administrators, they wanted nonprofits, they didn't want to lose their money, right? So there are all these things that are at risk that are at risk of loss for people. And so the way that the leaders, Marcos and Henry and Terry, these three leaders leveraged their relationships, built trust, and engaged communities was so powerful. And I don't want to give all the secrets away, but they're in the field, and I'm happy to share the resources with them. They were able to get folks to come to the table and sign. It wasn't a handshake. There was an agreement. It was like a trust agreement between and among organizations to share data, to honor confidentiality, but to work and align towards results for the kids and families in the east side of San Antonio.
And just a quick follow-up question. Could you just talk a little bit more specifically, if you know, like the level at which a level of data that they were sharing? Was it individual? Was it aggregated about their organizational performance? Say a little bit more.
Yeah. So aggregated organizational performance, but they also had individual data because they were dealing with students. And so Urban was involved, and there's these restricted use data files. Some folks may know what that is, where they had access to children's scores and things like that. And so there was a teacher's classroom of scores. So that level of data they had access to, so they had to figure out what do we need from this data set to support our work while also providing the cover and safety net for the teachers and the families involved. So they had a range, and different people held different parts of it, and they found a good common ground and got to aggregate performance and then population level data.
And,
super helpful.
And I can just jump in real quick to talk more about the sort of specific tools and the more technical aspect, because I think JaNay did a great job on the more adaptive relationship piece. And to be honest, just I think a lot of the answers to these questions are all about relationships, right? Even though it's focused on data, as with everything in collective impact, it comes down to those relationships. And so I would just on the specific technical side. We have a resource online, or we link to a resource rather around data sharing agreements that was put together by the NNIP, which is the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which comes out of the Urban Institute. That's a great resource about how do you set up those kinds of things that JaNay was talking about. What do they need to have? Some of them are very basic, some of them are very technical. And so if you're at that level thinking about what that could look like, I encourage you to check that work out. And in general, NNIP is just a really amazing organization and has a lot of resources. And then another one that I would point you to is it's the Strive Data Sharing Playbook. So we've worked with Strive, which I'm assuming everyone on this call knows about, for many years, starting back when they were based out of, or only focused on Cincinnati. And the data sharing and the or privacy issues have been a huge challenge. And they've done a ton of research, and they have a great resource specifically focused on education, data in education, but expands much broader than that. And I encourage you all to check that out as well.
Great. That's great. And I think lifting up both the technical and adaptive challenges is really important across much of collective impact work, but I always think about it in particular when it comes to the use of data. I think it is especially resonant. So let's change gears a little bit. Can you share any lessons learned for effectively presenting data to change minds and gain consensus? So technical and adaptive there too, I think.
Yep, sure. I'm happy to start on that. And again, this is I think I can't remember exactly how we put it in the series, but this is really where it becomes much more of an art than a science, right? Although of course science is still very much a part of this work. So a lot of different ways to do it, but I think what's essential, and I'll sort of repeat what JaNay said again just to drive it home, is that if there's not agreement at the start about what are we actually trying to measure, it's that presentation and the absorption of the data is challenging, right? You have to have your starting point, your North Star, and then once that's the case, or once you have that sort of agreed upon as a team, as a cross-sector table, presenting that data is really about getting what JaNay calls, the story behind the curve, and that's sort of a language from RBA, results-based accountability. That is, you have the data and you look at it and it's nice and it's on a graph and it looks very pretty, but what does that actually mean? What is the story behind that? And at Living Cities, we talk a lot about, okay, so it went down, the data went down, or it went up. Why? Why is that the case? And there are a lot of different tools that I can share really briefly to help not only present the data, but also tell the story behind the data, behind the curve. The data walks is a very effective tool, and some of you may have been a part of it without even knowing it. It's when there's sort of data on the wall at a meeting and you walk around and you sort of talk amongst yourselves about what it means. Again, Urban has a great resource on that. We've used Tableau, as has the Strive Network, great resource. And then there's the results-based accountability scorecard, which we've also used. That is it does many, many different things, but one of it is that story behind the curve. So that's the quick answer, although again, this is where the art comes in and you have to kind of work with those relationships. And so it can be a very specific, unique answer depending on what community you're a part of.
Jennifer, you're muted.
Thank you. We're talking about sharing data, and we actually asked the poll at the beginning of how often people are using data in their work. And I'm curious if you all have a perspective on how often a collective impact group should be looking at data as a collective. Every meeting, quarterly, and how does the kind of data differ depending on the frequency?
That's a great question. I will start. So if you are working in a community, with people, I think you should be looking at data weekly. Now, but to your point, Jennifer, what type of data? And again, data, folks, is information, right? So there's the quantitative stuff that we go out and collect and we survey for, and there are the interviews and the focus groups. Sometimes data is a person on your team's story who comes to a meeting with some insights. And so if you start your meetings focused on your result, like what do we want to achieve in service of the work we're doing for communities or whatever the result is, all right, so what do we know, right? Where did we last leave off? That's actually data, so that you're not just starting, it's not a shot in the dark. By having some baseline of information, you can focus a conversation and be more productive in your journey to either solve problems, address concerns, generate solutions and ideas for staying the course or making course corrections. So there is a level of data that should be raised weekly. But then there's other measures that, like a monthly check-in is okay or a quarterly check-in is okay. Again, it just depends on the activities that are underway. And the timing for those things. Now, well, Jeff, do you want to jump in on that?
I was just going to really quickly call out a great resource that JaNay worked on called the Data Inventory, which you see on the screen. And again, these are all sort of linked to in our website at that link below. And the Data Inventory, we can talk more about that. It does a lot of different things to sort of help you align your work around data. But one of them is exactly what JaNay is talking about like how frequently can we get this data, how frequently should we be looking at it, and so you depending on what data and what metrics you want, you're kind of constrained in your answer because some of it doesn't come out, weekly
right.
or whatever.
Right, that's good. Thanks, Jeff, for that.
Yeah. And we were talking about the use of data really to improve practice. And so how do you think about how would we think about coaching communities to actually use that data to strengthen the feedback loops in relatively real time so that you can actually have improved work happening on the ground?
Yeah, and in some communities I've worked in, they'll have like measure of the month. right? And someone owns it. So there's shared ownership, shared accountability. And so it's sort of, what are we going to focus on? Measure of the month was catchy, so that's what they use. You can, figure out what works for you, but, who owns that, and what's the information that you need to gather in your organization or from your team members or what's happening on the ground in order to have a conversation about how is this going to inform our work. In every meeting. So that said, look at the data, have a conversation about it, and Jeff has a whole, the series that he has about agree, to data, discuss data, et cetera. So you go through that process, but at the end, you've got to make action commitments. That sounds like a real simple thing, but I would guarantee that several of you have ended meetings with the intent to say, oh, we'll get some next steps, it's like next steps. Well, next steps and a commitment with a timeline and a person attached to it are very different things, okay? And so what we encourage is to walk away with a commitment to follow up or follow through or come back. So you start with data and you end with action.
And I'll just follow up or build on that with a really specific example around our work in New Orleans around increasing or decreasing the unemployment rate of working age African American men. We've worked with the city there, and they've been on a journey, again, as JaNay sort of discussed at the outset, of doing this work, and for a while, they had these continuous improvement monthly meetings, and it takes time, and they have these, sort of set standard agendas where they go back to every month around, what are people working on and what can they do over the next month. And actually the sample data meeting agenda is adapted from what they use. And so again, art and science, they've got the data, they're using the data, but they're building those relationships to actually have people, when they say, yes, we will do this, they put a name and a timeline to it, and then, at the next month they talk about how that went.
And just one quick thing, Jennifer, it's rocky. It's a rocky start at first because people are not used to it. Data has been used to penalize folks. It's been punitive. It's been about compliance. In the work that we're doing, it is not to penalize. It's not punitive. It's not about compliance. It's about accountability. It's about getting results for people. So don't fret if you start this process and people start freaking out about it. Engage that energy in a way that you can use it. You can fuel what you're trying to do. So give the work back to the group. All right, how would you suggest it? How are we going to make decisions if we're not looking at data? And if we don't have the data, let's create something based on our lived experiences and connections and communities so that we can start somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I have a colleague who, Hallie Preskel, who leads a lot of evaluation work, and she, I've been in meetings where she has people draw a picture of what they think of when they think of data and evaluation, and you see such a range. You see people who draw, daggers or hammers, and then you also see people who are drawing lights or magnifying glasses. And I always think of that visual and encourage people in collective impact to really, really think about data and evaluation type activities as really shining a light on what's happening, or really bringing a magnifying glass to what's happening to better understand and improve our work. So that really resonates. So we're going to do one more question from the list that I have, but I'd encourage people to use the question box on the screen to provide any questions that are coming up for you listening to JaNay and Jeff. No question is too big or small. So the last question that I will pose is, we get a lot of questions about what data platforms or technology people should use for this purpose. And from your experience, what kind of data management systems are being used by the field, and are there any in particular that you've had experience with that you recommend?
Cool. I'll start. Can you hear me okay? I got a little feedback on that last part. I'm good? A
little feedback, but we can hear you.
Okay, great. So Jeff mentioned earlier Tableau. It's a software online that has captured lots of population level data, but is able to disaggregate information. It's a platform that takes census data or Bureau of Labor statistics data and presents it in a way to sort of allow you to have different kinds of conversations. So that platform has been helpful in our cities because we're focusing on jobs, income, and wealth. Good jobs, increased income, and wealth. And when we looked at, we'll use New Orleans again, when we got the data, Census Data Bureau, Labor Statistics data, and other sources, we were able to disaggregate by job industry, and we saw that all of the jobs that were paying below a living wage were in the service industry, right? And then rather than jobs that were in other industries paying higher than living wage, we were able to map the population over, like the people we're targeting are actually falling in the area where they're not actually paying well. And so that was like, okay, so what do we need to do about that? What does this mean for the partners at the table in the service industry, and how do we address that? So Tableau was really good for just like for sharing a landscape analysis of what was happening. I've also used the Clear Impact Scorecard, which has been built on the results based on the results-based accountability framework. And what's cool about that tool is it's a trend line tool where you could look at your data over time at the population level and at the performance level. As you all know, population data mostly comes in annually or every other year, so it takes some time to see the changes there. But in the scorecard, you can set it up so that it's on your deck, on your dashboard, but then you can list your program or your strategies and measure your performance along the way and sort of outline. And then there's space for outlining the story behind the curve, the partners, and doing some strategic planning. What's nice about that tool is that you can pull it up in any meeting and sort of capture the conversation, the stories, the partners, the next steps, the action commitments as they are related to specific measures. So those are two tools that I've worked with, and then I've also used Excel, and I've used a pen and a paper. And I say that with some humor because there are helpful data platforms out there, but when data platforms are introduced into an organization, an institution, a team, a system, they become scapegoats, and work avoidance happens. You can use a pen and a paper and write it down. So just be mindful as you're trying to find platforms that, like, do you actually have the data to put in the platform and make the most use of the platform? What conversations need to happen? What organization and coordination needs to go down? Who needs to be accountable for what? Like, those conversations and that work, that organization has to happen early on, and it can't just be the data person on your team. And I've seen that a gazillion times over, and work gets shut down, and it's the scorecards for it. It's Tableau. No, it's not. What's happening? So don't avoid work because of challenges with the platform. So that's my plug.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore that and say, I think when we were talking to, we talked to about 16 to 20 different individuals at various levels of this work, and what was so interesting to me was hear about how the conversation on data gets conflated about a conversation on software, and sort of people think of it as one of the same, and then that just causes all kinds of problems for exactly how JaNay is outlining it, and it becomes a conversation about tech savviness, and it becomes a conversation about if computers can support this kind of thing, and just and it becomes real work avoidance. And so it was really interesting for me to hear from people consistently about like, the software is important, but that's not where you start. And if that is where you're trying to start, maybe take a step back and think through it a little bit more. One quick thing, we're getting some questions about the link. Actually, that link needs to be all lowercase. So if you're trying to look at all these resources, I promise they exist. Just the L and the C and the D, C, I should all be lowercase. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Jeff. Great. So I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Robert, who's been monitoring the questions that are coming in, to start sharing some of the real-time questions from our participants today.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And just to build on your comment, Jeff, if folks want to access the link now and are having trouble, you can do the lowercase thing that Jeff mentioned, or it's also the link is in the questions box. My colleague, Tracy, who's monitoring things on the back end, was helpful in adding that if you need to access it real time, but we'll definitely share it afterwards as well, along with the recording of this conversation and the few slides that we have up. So as Jen mentioned, there's a lot of great questions coming in. One question that came in, kind of building on this conversation around the how of using data, a question around budgeting. So how do you think about the recommended percentage, dollars, or staff time that collective impact initiatives should put aside for data collection and analysis?
Yeah, good question. So this is without hard numbers. If data is central to your work, then it should be prioritized in terms of dollars and staff time. So there may be someone on your team who is the point person or who is the accountability holder around data, but members of a collective impact initiative should have some ownership in their data. It should be a part of their work, or else it will sort of get pushed to the side. My apologies if I don't have hard and fast, but it should be prioritized. And I'll think a little bit more about actual numbers.
And Robert, is that including staff? And I don't know if the question says, but is that like full everything?
I think that's what the person was getting at, was not just maybe dollars of having a software license, but also the potential staff time and then resources on the staffing side as well.
Yeah.
And I can just say that, and this actually came from some of the work that the Collective Impact Forum did, is that it seems like the first hire often at an initiative, the backbone is around data, right? So I think, like JaNay is saying, if you prioritize it, that's so usually. And what we've seen is that you usually need one individual FTE who can work on this. And so again, depending on where you're working and what that looks like, that can be a significant part of your budget.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's not really, what I'm hearing is that there's not a hard and fast percentage necessarily. A lot of it depends on kind of case specific, depending on the size of the initiative. I think that was another thing the person was getting at, was is there a general rule of thumb around percentage of total budget?
My perspective, I have a point of view about this that is not, so know that there's complete bias in here. And I would say you need someone dedicated to data. The challenge with that is then that person gets all of the data stuff and nobody else owns it. And so they should have resources. And there are levels, right? So if it's one person's job to do it, then they should have some sort of resources, whether it's through partnerships, right? So you get a data partner at the table and their contribution, rather than dollars, is a team of folks who can support data stuff. Or they have a budget. But again, it depends on what level of information and data you're collecting, and you do have to get creative with your resources. But yeah, it should be a part of your core operating expenses. How much?
Yeah, and
depends.
Sorry. I'll give a shout out to some of the resources on the Collective Impact Forum that we also again link to in the blog. Is the sample job descriptions, and one of them is around kind of a data manager position, and a lot of that is around facilitation, relationship building, and sort of getting at what JaNay is saying. It's like, it's not that they just are, in the corner crunching numbers, but working with people and making sure that they're holding them accountable for that continuous improvement based on what the data is saying.
Great. Thank you for adding that detail to that. That's helpful. So this next question, someone had asked, have you compiled indicators across the cities that you're working in? So Living Cities is in this unique position of, you all have this vantage point across multiple communities, and this question gets at, have you seen kind of a database of common indicators, or just a starting point as people think about maybe in a specific issue area where you've seen some commonalities around indicators the groups are tracking?
Yeah, sure. So across the cities that we're working the deepest in, we're collecting median wage, for example. We're collecting unemployment and underemployment. We're looking at living wage. There's MIT has a calculator that they're using to calculate living wage. Right now, there's no consistent tracking of living wage specifically across the board, but we are looking at those across our communities just to kind of get a sense for them. So yeah, so we actually have a set of common indicators.
And just to give a little more context, so Living Cities is a funder collaborative, and we're supported by 18 of the world's largest foundations and financial institutions like Ford, Gates, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and because of that sort of broad scope, we work in over 100 different cities at different touch points. And so the kind of the work that the data tracking that JaNay is talking about is happening in certain areas and not in others, but we are looking at different ways to sort of synthesize, standardize that data across those cities, whether it's census or other things. We've learned a lot from the Strive Together network about those common indicators, common outcomes, and we're working that on our end. So I think we'll have more to come on that for sure, but I think the Strive network definitely has a lot of great information. So if you haven't looked at all of their stuff, I encourage you to do that around those common indicators and common outcomes.
Great. This next question builds on, I think, what you both talked about earlier about that, relationships really matter in the context of data and collective impact. And this question that came through about, do you have any examples of using the community themselves, those that are going to be impacted by the collective impact work, in the collection of data about the issues that matter most to them? So talk a little bit more about how you've seen those with lived experience brought into the process of gathering and analyzing, making sense of data.
Great. Yeah, I'm actually in San Francisco right now, and so I will use San Francisco. San Francisco is working with they have an initiative called Hope SF, and there are families in supportive housing in a particular area in San Francisco who have the most need, right? But imagine we're in San Francisco, which has like huge amounts of wealth, and so there's a huge gap in income and wealth and opportunities and so forth. And so there are problems that the leaders in San Francisco can solve for San Francisco, and the folks in the Hope SF sites will still get left out because of the disparities here. So what the team is doing is they've got residents at the table. So they've got residents at their various collective impact tables. They've got like working groups. They are training residents in collective impact and results-based accountability. Residents are part of selecting performance measures. Residents are a part of the design of their communities. We were on a tour yesterday, and in some of the sites you could tell where residents were involved, and we went to this other site, and I had asked, I said, well, did the residents contribute to this design? Because what is this space over here? And they said, yeah, we needed a little more contribution because this is not how they're actually not using the space because it wasn't created with them. And so they learned that lesson, and now the residents are really involved in designing spaces for where they live. So yeah, they come to all of the convenings. They lead on various initiatives. So the residents in San Francisco is really committed to community. It's not just community engagement, like, hey, community, what do you want to do? But it's actually community led.
Yeah, and I'll add another plug. Oh, can you guys hear me okay? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Another plug I'll give is for our community engagement e-course we did a couple years ago in partnership with Collective Impact Forum. There's a lot of great resources, generally speaking, about community engagement. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between community engagement and the use of data. I'll point to a couple specific examples beyond what JaNay sort of outlined. That the work that I mentioned before in New Orleans, they actually began that with a sort of survey of the community that they're working with, which is great and I think needs to be done more frequently. But not only that, they used community members and trained community members to do that survey. So it was community led. They sort of invested in this in this community to actually survey the community rather than sort of importing others to come in. And so that was the start of their work. That was creating the data using the community and from the community. And they've continued to sort of go back and connect with the community members to see how their work is doing, how that continuous improvement is going. And so they not only started with the community, but they're continuing to go back, and that the data is sort of driving that interaction. But it's very much and very intentionally focused on community, not just as a number, but also what are they feeling, what are they thinking, how are they doing, and how is that community thriving because of that work and because of that data.
Can I just add one more quick thing?
Sure.
C.O. Miller, who's the leader, one of the initiative directors in San Francisco, he has a tool that he uses with communities to get data. It's just an Excel sheet, and he said in his presentation last week and a half ago at the Collective Impact Forum, sometimes it's hard to get information, right, data, our technical word, from some of the leaders who are running these programs with folks, because they're like focused on serving people, right? So it's like, wait, you need numbers from me? And he said sometimes you just have to have like a sheet tucked in your back pocket for your own reference, but just ask the guy, like, hey, so I mean, who did you see last week? Just tell me the story. And from the quick conversation, he was able to say, okay, he saw 4 people. They were able to get, enrolled in the class, and he actually went back and put that in the sheet and made something of it. And so that relationship piece is really important, but there are ways to use tools that creatively. So, and if I think I can get that from him. It might be on Jen, it might be on your website from the presentation, but if not, I'm happy to get it and share it with everyone.
And one other quick tool plug is on it's called the Spark Insight survey. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's again linked to on our blogs. And it's essentially kind of another way to get at what JaNay is talking about. It's a one-page survey. It's like 3 or 4 questions. A really quick, easy way to sort of survey someone in front of you or do a more larger canvas. And that's something that actually our partners in Seattle King County have had a lot of success with as well.
And Jeff, to follow up on what you were saying about what they did in New Orleans, where they had the community actually administer the survey, if you've seen either there or in other communities where they've actually provided stipends or honoraria for the community's time to actually deliver that, so that you're respectful of their time and all the competing priorities that they have. Talk a little bit more about how you've seen communities, if you are going to engage those with lived experience, how you honor their time and think about actually setting aside resources to compensate their time.
Yeah, I can start real quick, and then JaNay, I know you have a lot of examples as well. So New Orleans, really straightforward. They paid them for their time like they would anyone else, and that was sort of a job training, but also an income source. And this is kind of moving away from the data conversation, but one organization that we've worked a lot with and have featured a lot is called Nexus Community Partners in the Twin Cities, and they have done something called the Board. They continue to do the Boards and Commission Leadership Institute, which is also has a chapter. Work is done across the country, but Urban Habitat does that work in Oakland, and that is people are a part of a cohort. And they learn more about engaging on boards. The leader, it's basically a leadership training program, just like anyone else would do, and that leads them to being placed on different community leadership roles. I'm not actually sure about the structure of if there's compensation or payment for that. JaNay, I don't know if you know of others what that works like, but I know it's commonly done.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the structure for Nexus, but I know in Seattle, even with us, when we invite communities to participate in something, our leaders will say, don't forget, you got to pay them. And we're like, oh, okay, just like we would pay a consultant. So we try to practice that as well and encourage.
Great. I wanted to come back, JaNay, to a comment you made before about that using data should not be about compliance and not about it being punitive, more about accountability and generating results. One of the questions we got was on that thread around accountability. So this person said, you've been using the word accountability a lot. So my question is, why would an organization want to be accountable to others from the outside? How does accountability reinforce each organization's activities? I think it builds on the conversation thread about buy-in, but how have you seen collective impact partners kind of build true buy-in and get that kind of accountability frame out there more so than the compliance being drug into the process versus actually being kind of bought into it?
Yeah, this is tough. I mean, it's not easy. And I love that I get to just sit here and say, oh, do this, right? So I totally understand and recognize the challenges there. I'd even sort of push back on me and say, well, start in your communities with, well, what does accountability actually mean to you? Because words generate images in our minds and like a storyline. And so I use accountability in a way where I'm working towards creating conditions of well-being for people in communities, period, right? Like I'm accountable to that because I'm results for people. That's I want outcomes for people. That's where I'm at. And so if I'm going to do this work, that's where my heart is, and I want to be accountable to the people. So I would start with, well, what does accountability mean to us? Because that language may trigger some negative reactions or responses that are similar to the language of compliance. So there's that. The second part of so Robert, say the second part of the question again. I'm sorry. The organization, the part with organizations.
I think you spoke to the main part of it. I probably just added more to the question that was clearly stated by the person on the line. So I think you spoke to it. I think that the main thing was about this accountability question. How do you ensure that organizations see themselves as not just accountable to their own board and constituents, but to a broader network of partners and those in the community that might not be they're directly serving?
Yeah,
and
yeah. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll just jump in. This is a much bigger conversation, but I think we just had this conversation last week as an organization at Living Cities is around like sort of what are the forcing mechanisms for large-scale sustainable community change, right? Which is the outcome of collective impact. That's what it's sort of designed to do. And, we talked about a few different things. There's different financing mechanisms out there, pay for success, pay for performance. And, one of the things we really, talked a lot about is community pressure and community will, right? And what do we want the community what does the community want to see? And that kind of gets exactly to what JaNay is talking about. And I think if it sort of flips the script somewhat on, okay, why would I be accountable to another organization based on what my funders are saying or whatever? But it's actually, okay, how am I accountable to the community? And that's I'm not saying that people don't think that now. Of course, everyone in a mission-driven organization is responsible to a community outside of our internal organization. But, how do we think about coalition building, community-based advocacy, support, investment, and use that as a way to sort of bring everybody together?
Yeah. This another note on it. The private sector is when they're at the table, a question they're asking is like, how is this impacting my bottom line? And so there's tension here, right? Because I'm looking at the bottom line and they're looking at like dollars and cents, and from the social sector, I'm looking at people. And so how do you, some of it's translation. It's the benefit for all in dollars, cents, people, community, systems, so some of it is like doing some work to make the case and explain that bottom line benefit, whether it's the bottom line for the social sector or business, because it actually impacts us all.
Great. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get to 2 more questions. So one, there's a couple of questions along this thread about building on the conversation before about the frequency by which you're gathering data, and this question about how do you address lag times in data? So if it's you want it to be as real time as possible, but a lot of times the data may not come in until it's several months or even longer removed from when you want to act on it. So have you seen examples where communities have done a good job of acknowledging and adapting to that lag time?
Trying to think of a specific example, and then also managing clock time. Do you want to start, Jeff?
I can just do a quick. I think this is maybe more of a non-answer, but I think when you think about what data you're tracking, you just have to build in sort of proxy measures, right? Like you're going to have lagging indicators, leading indicators. I mean that kind of gets into the evaluation design and logic models, which we don't have time to talk about right now. But you sort of structure. Okay, we're going to get this data, and I'll just plug again the data inventory. This really, if you open that resource, it'll help you do that. Okay, we're going to get this every month. This connects to what we're going to get every quarter, which connects to what we're going to get every year. And then you have to just use that monthly, weekly, whatever it is, data on as a way to say, okay, this is going to lead to that. And it's really about structuring your data-driven feedback loop, which again, there's a resource right there, as a way to sort of get at that time issue.
Great. Perfect. Another question, we haven't talked about this, but I think it might be on several people's minds. It's a question that came in about what's the role if you're in a community that has the university partner that might have a lot of in-house data analysis capacity or expertise. How have you seen communities particularly tap into universities to partner with those in the community on the data collection and analysis front?
Yeah. I'm glad that question is asked because I was going to talk about them a little earlier. Sometimes, so universities can be really resourceful, but universities also have a particular interest, and so there's it can be challenging, period. The way to engage universities really is to like put the interest on the table. What are your interests? What are our interests, and how do we get them aligned? Like you've got to do that work up front. There's also an approach that universities have. Academics are my background, and sometimes it's evaluative. It's sort of at the end of something. And in this work, we need to start at the beginning with the end, if you will. So what do we want to achieve, and how do we back map in that? And how do we collect data along the way, like get dynamic information that's dynamic, performance, because we want to make mid-course corrections, et cetera, et cetera. And so you've got to have the university partner engaged up front in those conversations and contributing to the design of the work, and then also sort of honoring what are you also trying to pull out of this to make meaning and contribute to learning and to contribute to knowledge in the field. So.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate something JaNay was alluding to earlier is, it's great to have that partner and the technical expertise, but if they're not a sort of a full player, right, and it's like, oh, you give them the data, and then that's not the full partnership, and that makes it harder to analyze the data and do anything with the data because it's seen as, oh, but University X's thing over there.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. The questions I've gotten have been excellent. I wish we had another hour to dig into these. Maybe I'll just ask before I turn it over to Jen, any 30 seconds each that you would share a final parting piece of advice or something maybe that you want to reiterate or we haven't had a chance to touch on. Just each of you 30 seconds to close before we turn it back to Jen.
I'm ready. Sorry, disaggregate data.
Oh.
Hard to do, super hard to do, but talk about resources, realign, readjust your resources to make sure that you disaggregate data. And if that means people have to create something and do some door knocking, Lubbock, Texas knows how to do that work. The Promise neighborhood in Lubbock, Texas, and there are other places to do, but disaggregate that data so you don't leave large portions of people out of the results.
And I'll just sort of reiterate the relationships. You build the relationships. Don't worry so much about the technical aspect, particularly the relationships with the community.
Terrific. Jeff and JaNay, thank you so much. I feel like we covered a lot of ground for an hour, and certainly your experience both deep in communities and lifting up across the different investments of living cities has been really, really helpful for me personally and also for the over 300 folks that joined us today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The Collective Impact Forum will follow up with an email that has a link to this recording as well as a updated working link to the website that Jeff has pointed us to for many resources. Thank you also for mentioning several other resources, and I think that this has just been a wealth of information for people. So I wish everyone a great day when we're heading into summer, and so we're actually going to a month or two off from doing our virtual coffees, which we've had the last 4 months, but really enjoyed having you all join us over the last few months. Look forward to doing more in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Have a great day.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.